Hello, in this video I want to start off some of the conversation that we'll be having in terms of how I think policy teams should be responding to accelerationism when they're on the affirmative, in kind of response to some of the other videos that I've done in the introduction to accelerationism and talking about accelerationism as a negative strategy versus policy teams. As you've seen with some of the other types of videos that I've done like this, where I've done these kind of longer drawn out series, I try to do these kind of two-part videos where I talk about different ways in which arguments are both executed and answered in ways that I think can be better in order for you to better identify the priorities that you have for those arguments and the way that you should be generally framing different portions of the flow in order to create the best argument possible, and the one that kind of best fits the way that you kind of want to use the strengths of the arguments that I think are the most reliable and the ones that I think really fit the kind of topic that we're talking about head on. And so if you haven't, it's really important to look into and listen to the other videos that I've done talking about accelerationism, even if it's only the intro to accelerationism, because I think there are a lot of ways in which you can spin and talk about a lot of specific interests that I'll be talking about in this video in particular, and the next video that I'll be doing, that I think definitely needs a lot of that background info in order for this to make sense. In this video I'll mostly be focusing on talking about what I think is what are the key priorities for how policy teams should be responding to this type of argument in accelerationism, and the ways in which I think it specifically frames the framing the thesis portion of the debate, in order to kind of give context for the next video I'll be doing, kind of talking about the other portions of the flow. And in order to think about maybe some of what are the priorities against an accelerationist argument, I think that there are a lot of really nuanced ways that you can force a team to really have to take on a lot of baggage of accelerationism that I think can be really hard to get out of, and I think can also allow you to pin offense about even if they're able to make arguments at scale, the way in which they require particular management of scale kind of ultimately results in a lot of arguments that I think are offensive and good for things like the permutation. I think allow you to make a lot of really diverse types of arguments, especially on the upcoming water resolution. I think that the water resolution, kind of like I said before, brings so many conversations to the forefront about technology, the way that we manage it, and the way we think about the development of it in the context of water resources and different energy sources. And I think that when that kind of conversation begins, accelerationism has a lot to say in terms of how those resources are used, which then transfers a lot onto the kinds of conversations that I think you can make, putting about maybe some holes in the theory of the way in which they're thinking about the development of technology and what it looks like in the creation of the vision of the alternative. I think that when you're really trying to figure out what are the key places where you're trying to stick offense, really trying to get into the nitty gritty of the alternative is extremely important in order to create more burdens for the negative in terms of their ability to make their examples really prominent, and will also allow you to make arguments that are really dependent on the ability to create, that are really important to create a kind of sound set of offense that applies to both the link debates and the permutation debates, from the way in which you're just framing the way in which the judge should understand the viability of the alternative versus the affirmative, which I think frames a lot of the questions that we'll be talking about going into the rest of this video. When you're thinking about just generally what are some of the kind of framing arguments that you want to make when you're debating against an argument like this, I think it's really important to make arguments that are in the line of how you can force the alternative to be a key part of the judge's evaluation, because I think that although that the kind of accelerationist side of things definitely for us things as the alternative has a lot of ways in which you can concretely talk about these various tactics that people have taken up to kind of organize the development of various technologies in its distribution. But I also think there are a lot of ways that you can make arguments about how the kind of counter theories that have been offered in terms of right accelerationism and the kind of removal of government as a structure kind of opens up the increased privatization and acceleration of things in a way that's much more violent, in which the way in which the kind of 1AC is able to establish a kind of step-by-step process via the plan. And I think that being able to set that up in terms of how you want the judge to understand your framing arguments is really important. This means that when you're reading your interpretation and you're doing things like trying to say why the judge should evaluate the affirmative and the consequences of it against not only just the link arguments to the criticism, but also the alternative, and specifically the scale of the alternative to be able to resolve whatever existential crises or types of environmental water crises that the affirmative is kind of presenting or speaking on. I think that centering that benefits about why talking about the specific planning process is important, and talking about why mobilizing debate is a space for the specific planning process allows us to get closer kind of these visions, even if it leaves different things in part of the future open to a change in terms of how people take up and respond to different types of ways of thinking about the redistribution of sources like water and other types of structural injustice. And I think that opening up that kind of frame allows you what seems like a really open contestation between the affirmative and the alternative. But I think when you you get into the nitty gritty of what I think is some of the offense against the alternative later on, I think it makes a lot more sense in terms of why this framing actually creates a lot harder way for the alternative to kind of keep up with the way in which you're utilizing this, but the preciseness of the affirmatives plan and the way in which the judge can see the results and evaluate it in relationship to the kind of like more open interpretation I think the alternative takes on these types of questions. And I think that in a world where you're able to kind of like push the impact comparison in debate that doesn't require you to win it outright, but to do so in a way that like really just situates the debate in which you're kind of like interacting with the structure of the negative in a way that's unique, then I think you have a pretty good chance of being able to win that under this type of frame of argument. You can be really successful and produce arguments that I think are just generally beneficial and strategic for you. In the context of the thesis kind of portion of the debate, I think that it's really important in order to like understand and talk about the particular ways in which the idea of the progression and inevitable progression of technology may not be wrong, but that there can be an understanding of that in relationship to the necessity of like a government system, a centralizing institution that is able to deal with the management of such things, and the idea that the alternative can do so without the like installation of a kind of central institution that looks like or is the state allows like a lot of other questions to be drawn about like the way in which the alternative is actually able to be implemented. And so I think it's just a question of applying the types of offense that you want to the thesis based on the ways that you want to indict the way in which the negative resolves the thesis, even if you don't disagree with like the central arguments they're making based on like arguments that are sourced in like capitalism, especially when I think on the water resolution, even some of the arguments that move like harder to the side of like really talking about more of the existential side of like the water crisis will definitely still have conversations or at least evidence about the way in which that kind of like intersects with conversations about capitalism. I think and I think that will just happen broadly. And so I think that in that type of sense, if you have an argument that is at least some level interacting with this type of impact, you really need to put the judge into a world where regardless of whether or not they're right about the thesis, the resolution to that thesis is where their mind should be at for how they evaluate the weight of how it like changes their the way in which they're framing the rest of the flow. And I think that can help you kind of like lower like the pressure that kind of comes on when they have like a heavy thesis argument about why the 1AC is so contextualized by like these other sources of capital accumulation and ultimately pushes us towards like accelerationism as like a solution to that. And you can kind of break up that linkage of ideals by I think like really producing a way of thinking about the thesis portion of the debate only in the way in which the negative is able to resolve it and not as something that kind of like stands its own as powerful enough to kind of win the debate through and through. Hopefully this video was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll see the rest of the videos I'll be doing in terms of talking about accelerationism, because I have a lot more ideas in terms of how I think policy teams can respond to it and other ways that I think it gets involved in debate as a whole. And yeah, hopefully you just enjoy watching these videos. Thanks.